Think about the last time you wanted something badly enough that you were certain, genuinely certain, that getting it would change things. A relationship, a position, a level of income, a version of your life that felt just out of reach but close enough to feel real. You knew exactly what it looked like. You could feel the specific quality of the relief it would bring, and you told yourself, with the particular sincerity of someone who has not yet been disappointed by this particular thing, that once you had it, the restlessness would stop. You got it, or something close enough to count, and the restlessness did not stop. It paused, briefly, just long enough for you to register that what you were feeling was not quite what you had anticipated, thinner somehow than the imagined version, more conditional, already beginning to generate its own new insufficiencies. And then, before you had fully processed the gap between the expected satisfaction and the actual one, the wanting had already moved on. To the next thing, to the upgraded version of what you just obtained, to the new shape of the same hunger wearing different clothes. If you have lived long enough to recognize this pattern, and most people have, though few discuss it openly, then you have already encountered the central problem of Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy, not as an abstraction, as your own life. Schopenhauer was born in Danzig in 1788, the son of a wealthy merchant and a novelist mother who did not particularly like him. He was difficult, brilliant, constitutionally incapable of comfortable self-deception, and driven from early adulthood by a single philosophical obsession: the need to understand why human existence is structured the way it is, why the wanting never stops, why satisfaction is always thinner than anticipated, why the pursuit of happiness is a game whose rules seem designed to prevent anyone from winning it. He found his answer. It was not a comforting one, but it was, in its terrible precision, one of the most honest things any philosopher has ever said about the nature of human desire. And once you have heard it, really heard it, not as a philosophical curiosity but as a description of something you already know from the inside, you cannot entirely unhear it. Which is perhaps the point. He applied for a lectureship at the University of Berlin, and in what can only be described as a gesture of philosophical combat, scheduled his lectures at exactly the same hour as those of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the most celebrated philosopher in Germany, the intellectual colossus of the age. Hegel's lectures were packed. Students came from across the continent to hear him. Schopenhauer's room was empty. He persisted for one semester, then abandoned the attempt. He would spend the next 3 decades in relative obscurity, supported by a modest inheritance, living in Frankfurt with his poodle, whom he named Atma, the Sanskrit word for the world's soul, writing essays that almost nobody read, developing and refining a philosophy that almost nobody wanted. What they didn't want, it turned out, was the truth. Not the comfortable truth of Hegel's historical progress, in which every era of human suffering was a necessary step toward the rational self-realization of the world spirit. Not the optimistic truth of the Enlightenment, in which reason and education would gradually liberate humanity from its miseries. Not any version of the truth that allowed its recipient to feel that things were, on balance, moving in the right direction. What Schopenhauer was offering was something different, something that his contemporaries found professionally inconvenient and personally intolerable. A philosophy built not on hope, but on honesty. Not on what human beings wished reality to be, but on what, if they looked carefully enough and without the protection of consoling fictions, it actually appeared to be. He was offering the truth about suffering, about desire, about the engine that drives all living things and rewards none of them, about the world not as it should be but as it is, and about what, given that, a human being who takes their existence seriously might actually do with it. He was ignored for 30 years, then slowly he was read, and once read he was impossible to dismiss, because the thing about Schopenhauer, the thing that separates him from the merely pessimistic, is that his darkness is not a mood. It is a diagnosis. And it is, in its terrible precision, recognizable, not as the description of how things go wrong, as the description of how things are. To understand Schopenhauer's philosophy, you need to understand what he was replacing. The dominant tradition in Western philosophy, from Plato through Descartes through Kant, had placed reason at the center of human existence. The human being was, above all, a rational creature, distinguished from the animals by the capacity for thought, elevated above mere appetite and instinct by the power of the reflective intellect. Whatever the disagreements between individual thinkers, this much seemed settled. Reason was the defining and highest human faculty, and the task of philosophy was to understand how reason operates, what it can know, and what it prescribes for the conduct of a good life. Schopenhauer read Kant with enormous care and admiration, and took from him the crucial distinction between the world as we experience it, the world of appearances, shaped by the structures of human perception, and the world as it is in itself, the thing in itself that lies behind the veil of representation. Kant had argued that the thing in itself was permanently inaccessible to human knowledge. We can know only what our faculties of perception and reason deliver to us. The world as it actually is remains forever beyond our reach. Schopenhauer accepted this as far as it went, and then he took a step that Kant had not taken, a step that was, depending on your perspective, either a brilliant philosophical breakthrough or an act of breathtaking speculation. He argued that we have, in fact, direct access to the thing in itself, not through reason, not through the intellect, through the body, through the experience of desire, of appetite, of the blind, insistent pressure that we feel from the inside as will. The will to eat, to move, to reproduce, to continue existing, to possess, to become. That pressure, Schopenhauer argued, is not merely a feature of human psychology. It is the fundamental nature of reality itself. Beneath the surface of every individual thing, every human being, every animal, every plant, every stone, operates the same force. He called it the will, not a person's will in the ordinary sense, not a divine will with intentions and purposes, something prior to all of that, a blind, purposeless, insatiable striving that is the innermost nature of everything that exists. The world is not, at its foundation, made of matter, or of ideas, or of the thoughts of God. It is made of will, endless, objectless, self-consuming will, a force that drives all things forward without knowing where it is going, without arriving anywhere, without ever being satisfied. The universe is not a rational system moving toward a goal. It is an enormous appetite with no object adequate to satisfy it. This is the vision at the center of the world as will and representation, and once you have genuinely understood it, you cannot look at human existence in quite the same way again. The most important thing to understand about Schopenhauer's will is that it does not care about you. This sounds simple, perhaps even obvious, but its implications, followed honestly and without the cushion of comforting interpretation, are radical. The will is not a benevolent force that has your interests at heart. It is not a providential intelligence that has placed you in existence for a purpose. It is not moving toward any goal that your happiness would constitute. It has produced you through the mechanism of desire, of sexuality, of the biological imperative to continue the species as an instrument for its own perpetuation. And like every instrument, you will be used and discarded when the use is complete. What you experience as your deepest desires, for love, for achievement, for meaning, for connection, are not your desires in any ultimate sense. They are the will's desires, operating through you. The hunger you feel for any particular object is the will temporarily manifesting through the structure of your individual consciousness. When the object is obtained, the will does not rest. It moves immediately to the next object. The satisfaction you experience is not satisfaction. It is a brief interruption in the circuit of desire before the current resumes. Schopenhauer describes this with the image of a pendulum. Human existence swings between two poles, the suffering of want when the desired object is absent, and the boredom of satiation when it has been obtained. There is no stable resting point between them. The person who does not have what they want suffers. The person who has obtained what they wanted discovers that the satisfaction is thinner and briefer than anticipated, and finds themselves already beginning to want something else. The wanting does not stop. It cannot stop, because it is not a feature of any particular desire but a feature of the will itself, which operates through desire the way water operates through a channel. The channel changes, but the flow continues. This is why, Schopenhauer observes, the pleasures of anticipation almost always exceed the pleasures of possession. The imagination, constructing the future object of desire, projects onto it a fullness and a satisfaction that the actual object, subject to all the limitations of real things, cannot deliver. We spend our lives pursuing things that disappoint us upon arrival, and are replaced immediately by the next iteration of the same pursuit. Not because we are choosing badly, Because the structure of desire is such that satisfaction, in any permanent sense, is not available within it. The person who has understood this, really understood it, not as an intellectual proposition, but as a lived recognition of the pattern in their own experience, has understood something that most people spend their lives carefully avoiding. Because the alternative to avoiding it is to face, without flinching, the full implications of what Schopenhauer is saying, that the engine driving your life does not have your well-being as its purpose, that the things you want will not give you what you think they will give you, that the structure of existence is not arranged for your satisfaction and was never intended to be, that suffering is not an accident in your life that could have been avoided with better choices or better circumstances. It is the condition, the permanent, structural, ineliminable condition of a consciousness driven by a will that cannot be satisfied. This is the point at which most people, encountering Schopenhauer, either close the book or misread him. They close the book because the diagnosis is too dark. If suffering is the permanent condition of existence, if the will cannot be satisfied, if desire is structurally incapable of producing lasting happiness, then what is the point? What remains? The philosophy seems to lead nowhere but to despair, and despair seems like a poor foundation for a life. They misread him because they conclude that he is simply a pessimist, a man with a sour disposition who has dressed his unhappiness in philosophical language. This reading is convenient, but wrong. Schopenhauer was not simply describing the world as dark because he experienced it as dark. He was making a philosophical argument, one that can be evaluated, contested, and found more or less persuasive on its merits. And the argument, whatever one concludes about its ultimate truth, is not the same thing as depression. The distinction he was insisting on, between optimism and honesty, is one of the most important things he contributed to philosophy. Optimism, in his analysis, is not a virtue. It is a kind of cowardice, the refusal to look at what is actually there in favor of what one would prefer to find. The person who tells themselves that things are getting better, that suffering has a purpose, that the universe is arranged for human flourishing, is not being brave. They are being comfortable. And comfort purchased at the price of accuracy has a cost that accumulates over time. Pessimism, as Schopenhauer understood it, is not despair. It is intellectual honesty applied to the question of existence. It is the willingness to see what is there rather than what one would prefer to find, and to proceed from an accurate assessment rather than a flattering one. It is, in his view, not a more depressing way to live. It is a more honest way to live. And honesty, he believed, opens possibilities that the comfortable fictions of optimism permanently foreclose. Because once you have stopped expecting the world to arrange itself for your happiness, once you have genuinely relinquished the assumption that desire will be satisfied, that the will rest, that the pendulum will stop, something changes in the relationship between yourself and your experience. Not the experience itself, the relationship to it. The suffering does not diminish, but the particular additional suffering of believing that the suffering is wrong, that it is an aberration, that it will end when the right conditions are finally met, that suffering, which is considerable, becomes available for release. This is what Schopenhauer is reaching toward. Not resignation, not indifference. Something more precise and more demanding than either of those things. The possibility of living without the particular cruelty of disappointed expectation. Schopenhauer was not, despite what his reputation suggests, a philosopher without answers. He had answers. They were difficult and demanding and drew on sources that his contemporaries found surprising. But they were genuinely offered as paths through the predicament he had described, not merely as more elaborate ways of describing it. The first was art, specifically the experience of genuine aesthetic contemplation, the moment in which the individual will is temporarily suspended and the perceiving subject loses themselves in the pure perception of an object. In this moment, Schopenhauer argues, the tyranny of the will is briefly interrupted. The person who is genuinely absorbed in a piece of music, a painting, a work of literature, absorbed to the degree that they have forgotten themselves and their desires and become pure perceiving consciousness, has achieved a temporary release from the prison of individual willing. The will still operates everywhere else, but here, now, in this moment of genuine aesthetic experience, it has gone quiet. This is why Schopenhauer considered music the highest of the arts, because music, unlike painting or sculpture, does not represent the will's objects. It is the will itself made audible. To hear great music is to hear the fundamental nature of existence expressed in a form that the intellect can receive without being destroyed by it. It is the closest thing available to a direct encounter with the thing in itself, experienced not as suffering, but as form. The second path was compassion. If all individual existence is a manifestation of the same underlying will, if the suffering of another person is, at the deepest level, not other than your own suffering, then compassion is not an altruistic imposition on the self-interested structure of existence. It is a recognition of identity. The person who genuinely feels the suffering of another as their own has momentarily pierced the veil of individuation, the illusion that we are separate beings with separate interests, and perceive the underlying unity that Schopenhauer's metaphysics describes. Compassion is not morality imposed from outside. It is the natural result of seeing clearly. The third and most radical path was what Schopenhauer called the denial of the will, the systematic withdrawal of investment from the objects of desire, the cultivation of a life oriented toward the quieting of individual willing rather than its satisfaction. This is the path of the ascetic, the mystic, the saint, figures that Schopenhauer, alone among the major Western philosophers of his era, took with complete seriousness. He found the same wisdom in Buddhist and Hindu thought that he found in the Christian mystics, the recognition that the liberation from suffering available within the structure of existence is fundamentally a liberation from the will's dominion over consciousness. Nietzsche, who read Schopenhauer at 19 and called him his educator, would later reject this conclusion, arguing that the denial of the will was itself a disguised form of willing, that the ascetic ideal was the will turning against itself rather than genuinely transcending itself. Wagner, who found in Schopenhauer's philosophy the metaphysical foundation for his late operas, drew from it a vision of redemption through love and death that gave the pessimism a specifically romantic character. The Buddhists, whom Schopenhauer read with genuine comprehension and respect, had spent 2.5 millennia developing practical disciplines for the quieting of desire that his philosophy independently arrived at and described in Western philosophical language. All of these responses, different as they are, take seriously the same starting point, the recognition that the problem Schopenhauer identified is real, that it cannot be wished away or argued out of existence, and that living well requires engaging with it rather than avoiding it. What does Schopenhauer give us in the end? Not comfort. He was explicit about this, and it was part of what made him so difficult to receive. He gives us no assurance that things will work out, no promise that suffering has a purpose, no God who watches over the proceedings with benevolent intention, no historical arc bending toward justice, no rational structure beneath the apparent chaos that guarantees, in the long run, the vindication of the good. What he gives us instead is something rarer and more valuable than comfort. He gives us company in the dark. The experience of reading Schopenhauer, really reading him, with the willingness to follow his argument where it goes and to check it against one's own experience, is the experience of encountering a mind that has looked at the same things you have looked at and refused to pretend they are something other than what they are, the longing that does not resolve, the satisfaction that evaporates, the suffering that arrives without invitation and stays longer than seems fair, the gap between what you hoped for and what you received, the persistent low-level sense that existence is harder than it should be, that it costs more than it delivers, that the promises implicit in the structure of desire are systematically not kept. Schopenhauer did not invent these experiences. He described them. And in describing them with philosophical precision, without flinching and without false consolation, he did something that is genuinely useful to the person who has had them and found them unacknowledged by the more optimistic traditions of thought. He confirmed that you are not wrong, that what you have noticed about the structure of desire and the nature of satisfaction and the persistence of suffering is not a failure of perception or a defect of character or a problem that will be solved when you finally achieve the right circumstances. It is what is actually there. And from that confirmation, from the solid ground of accurate perception rather than the unstable ground of comfortable illusion, something becomes possible that optimism, for all its warmth, cannot offer. A different kind of relationship to one's own experience. A relationship that does not depend on the experience being other than it is. That can sit with the suffering without requiring it to justify itself. That can appreciate the brief intervals of genuine beauty and connection and stillness without grasping at them. That can move through a life that was not designed for human happiness, with something that is not happiness exactly, but is perhaps more durable than happiness. Schopenhauer called it, in his best moments, something close to serenity. Not the serenity of someone who has been given what they wanted, the serenity of someone who has stopped requiring the world to be what it is not, and discovered, in that relinquishment, a quietness that the restless willing of ordinary life never permits. That is not nothing. Given what the world actually is, it may be everything that is honestly available. And everything honestly available, Schopenhauer understood better than almost anyone, is worth more than anything dishonestly promised.